Have you ever wondered what loyalty is really worth when it's no longer convenient for the people in charge? I used to think that showing up early, staying late, and keeping your head down was how you earned respect, how you built something that would stand the test of time. I believed that if you gave your best to a company, they'd give you something back. Maybe not a parade or a plaque, but a handshake, a few kind words, and the security you worked for. My name is Malcolm Ritter. I'm 63 years old and I spent 30 years running operations at Ridgepoint Logistics. I helped build the place, literally. I was there when we installed the first tracking system, when we signed our first 7-figure contract, when we opened our second facility. I trained the teams, kept the lights on, and said yes to every weekend shift no one else wanted. 5 days. That's all I had left before my full pension would vest. That's when Connor Briggs, our new VP of Strategy, called me into a glass-walled conference room and said 12 words I'll never forget. We're downsizing. Hope there's no hard feelings. You understand business? I didn't say anything when he slid the papers across the table. I just looked at them, typed up paragraphs about restructuring and cost-saving measures, termination clauses, and severance details. All neat, all impersonal. I nodded once, folded the papers, and walked out without a word. But as I stepped back, into the hallway I had walked every morning at 6 a.m. for 3 decades, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet, just an emptiness, like someone had pulled the floor out from under a house I'd spent my life building. I started at Ridgepoint in the spring of 1994. Back then, we were just a mid-sized shipping company trying to survive in a market dominated by giants. The warehouse floors were cracked, the break room microwave was older than most of the staff, and our first digital tracking system was a glorified spreadsheet on a floppy disk. But I didn't care. I'd just gone through a divorce, lost my savings, in the process. And Ridgepoint was the first company that took a chance on a man in his early 30s who didn't have a degree, but could fix anything with duct tape and a wrench. I showed up early. Every day, even before it was expected. I learned the names of every driver, every dock supervisor, every vendor who crossed the loading bays. I figured out how to stop the HVAC system from freezing over in January without shutting down operations, how to manage inventory with a budget that wouldn't stretch, how to talk a shipping inspector out of red flagging a pallet because it was 2 inches off protocol. I didn't complain when I had to work Christmas Eve or when storms knocked out the power and I spent the night in the control room rebooting systems so trucks could roll out by morning. I stayed late, not because it was required, but because it mattered. Because I believed in being the guy people could count on. The company grew. Little by little, we picked up new contracts, expanded to a second warehouse, then a third. I helped scout locations. I worked with the architects to make sure our new logistics center had what we needed: power redundancy, ventilation, fire, suppression systems. I wasn't in the C-suite, but they listened when I talked. At least they used to. When I walked into a room, it wasn't with swagger, just quiet authority. I knew where every fuse box was, which vendor delivered on time, and which managers could hold their teams together when everything hit the fan. For a long time, I thought that was enough. That being dependable meant being valued. I didn't keep score. I didn't ask for raises unless it was absolutely necessary. I kept binders of procedures updated every year. I trained the new hires myself when HR fell behind. I taught them not just how to do the job, but how to care about it. I even stayed after my wife got sick. The company's health insurance covered part of her treatment. I used all my vacation days for hospital visits, never asked for special treatment. When she passed away 7 years ago, I came back to work the next Monday. I needed the routine. The warehouse was quiet that morning. A few people nodded, but no one said anything. That was fine. Ridgepoint had become my second home. Familiar, solid, predictable, until it wasn't. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just believed that hard work should mean something, that you don't have to be flashy or loud if you're steady, if you're the guy who shows up, solves problems, and doesn't make excuses. I didn't chase promotions. I didn't angle for politics. I just kept showing up because I thought that counted for something, and maybe for a while it did. But not anymore. The thing about betrayal is, it doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in the form of polite silence, a clipboard, and a half-hearted apology. That's what happened to me. After 30 years of dedication, I didn't get a meeting with someone from the board, or even a direct call from the CEO. I got a 10-minute sit-down with a man half my age who wouldn't look me in the eye, and a folder that spelled out the end of everything I'd built. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was 5 business days before my pension benefits were scheduled to fully vest. 5 days. After that, Ridgepoint would have been contractually bound to pay out a full benefits package I'd earned through 3 decades of loyal work. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was written all over Connor Briggs's face, the forced, neutral expression, the rehearsed tone, the way he kept repeating phrases like nothing personal and difficult decisions. Connor was one of those rising stars. Clean haircut, shiny MBA, the kind of guy who says words like efficiency and optimization like they're moral virtues. He'd only been at Ridgepoint a year, brought in as part of some consulting initiative to modernize operations. I should have paid more attention when he started scheduling private meetings with senior staff, asking oddly specific questions about job duties and cross-training. That day, he sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room I helped design during the facility expansion in 2010. A room I'd once proudly given tours in. Now I was on the other side of the table, treated like a liability. "We've evaluated department redundancy and long-term operational risk," Connor said, flipping through my file like he was reviewing a budget spreadsheet. "Unfortunately, your role is being phased out." My role, not me, my role. As if 30 years of knowledge, judgment, and lived experience could be reduced to a task description. "You understand, Malcolm," he added, finally looking up. "It's not personal. It's a business decision." I wanted to ask him if it felt personal when he clicked print on the termination letter, if he slept fine knowing he'd cost me my entire retirement security for the sake of quarterly margins. But I said nothing, just nodded. I'd seen what happened to others who got emotional in those meetings: security escorts, HR follow-ups, dignity stripped at the door. He pushed a pen across the table. "You'll receive severance equal to 4 weeks' salary. COBRA details are outlined in the packet. We'll need your badge and keycard." That was it. 4 weeks. No pension. No benefits. No handshake for the man who once stayed overnight during a winter blackout to reset the electrical grid and save a warehouse full of perishable freight. I unclipped my badge from my belt loop. The plastic had worn smooth over the years, the photo faded. It was a younger version of me, hair darker, posture straighter. I handed it over without a word. I didn't trust myself to speak. The keyring was heavier. On it were keys to every dock door, server room, and emergency panel in the facility. I'd earned that level of trust not by asking for it, but by proving, time and again, that I knew what I was doing, and that I gave a damn. I placed the keys in his hand, and for a brief second I saw something flicker in Connor's eyes. Not remorse, no, not that, just discomfort. Like he knew at some level what he was doing was wrong, but not enough to stop it. He stood to shake my hand, probably because it was in the script they'd given him. I ignored it. Walking through the office that day was surreal. People avoided eye contact. A few glanced up from their monitors, recognized what was happening, and immediately looked away. No one said goodbye. No one asked questions. They were scared. I couldn't blame them. I passed the loading dock, the one I helped design to improve freight flow and reduce winter slip hazards. Walked by the break room where I'd spent countless mornings drinking bad coffee and talking shop with mechanics and clerks. My truck was parked in its usual spot near the south entrance. I sat inside with the engine running, staring at the building that had become part of my identity. 5 days. That's all I needed. 5 more days, and I would have walked out of that place with my head high, with something to show for the decades I gave. But instead, I sat there alone, unemployed, and stripped of what I had earned by people who saw me as an expense instead of a person. That was the day I realized. They didn't just fire me. They erased me. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, circling the block twice before pulling into my driveway. The house felt too quiet. I dropped the manila folder on the kitchen table, where the overhead light caught the edge of the Ridgepoint letterhead, and just stared at it. For a few hours I tried to let it go, told myself it was just bad luck. A bad decision by a company I'd once trusted, but something about it wouldn't settle. Not the timing, not the way Connor avoided eye contact. Not the numbers. I wasn't the kind of man who questioned every policy memo or chased conspiracies. But I kept good records. Always had. That night I pulled out the drawer in my home office where I kept old files, pay stubs, performance reviews, training certifications, and copies of the employee handbook. The most recent one had been sent out a month ago, folded into the back of a company newsletter. I hadn't paid it much attention at the time. Now it read differently. There it was, in section 7.4 of the revised handbook. Retirement benefit. Eligibility is based on 30 years of continuous service or reaching the age of 65, whichever comes first. It matched what I'd always understood. I had 30 years in, full stop. I started at Ridgepoint on May 3, 1994. That meant my 30-year mark would have landed on the following Friday. The day they terminated me was Monday, 5 days short. I opened the termination letter. It claimed my start date was June 1st, 1994. A month later, just enough to cut me off from eligibility. That didn't sit right. I pulled out my original offer letter, the one printed on yellowed paper with a barely legible Ridgepoint header. May 3rd, clear as day, signed by a now retired VP and timestamped by HR. There was no ambiguity. Then came the kicker. Tucked behind the updated handbook was a memo from Connor Briggs, sent to all department heads just 3 weeks earlier. It was about cost alignment, strategies, and benefit structure clarification. One paragraph buried near the bottom noted, effective immediately, eligibility for retirement benefits will be evaluated based on active tenure data as stored in payroll systems, superseding earlier informal agreements. That wasn't just legal jargon. That was a setup. I pulled up my digital pay stubs from the company portal. Thankfully, I downloaded them regularly. According to payroll, my first entry was indeed June 1st. But that wasn't right. I'd started working in early May. The error had likely occurred when they transitioned to a new HR platform in 2010. At the time, there were reports of data mismatches, but no one made a fuss. I'd shrugged it off. Now that tiny data error had become a very convenient reason to deny me what I'd earned. Could it have been a mistake? Maybe. But the more I read that memo, the more I felt a chill crawling up my spine. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was too clean, too precise. Just enough to fall under the radar, unless someone was paying attention. What gnawed at me most wasn't just the error. It was how confident Connor had seemed when he spoke to me. The way the paperwork had already been printed. The way he mentioned my exact tenure without hesitation, as if the decision had been calculated down to the day. Not a week off, not a few months. Just barely enough to disqualify me from my benefits. That night, I sat at my desk, surrounded by binders and file folders, highlighted memos and post-it notes. I knew that look. Paperwork designed to confuse, to discourage questions, and I'd seen just enough cracks to know where to start digging. The questions were getting louder now. Had this happened to anyone else? Was I the only one they'd done this to? And if I wasn't, who else had they quietly erased? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the soft tick of the old wall clock my wife had loved, its rhythm suddenly sounding less like time passing and more like a countdown. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and no amount of rationalizing could quiet the feeling that I had been maneuvered out of my retirement, not as part of a business decision, but as part of a plan. So I got up, made a pot of coffee, and started pulling everything together. Over the next 2 days, I turned my house into a records office. Every binder, every flash drive, every cardboard box from the garage labeled with years, 1994, 1995, 2001, was pulled open and spread across the dining table. There were stacks of pay stubs dating back to the paper check days, printouts of annual evaluations, newsletters with staff recognition blurbs, and dozens of inter-office memos I'd saved out of habit, not intention. It wasn't long before the pattern started to take shape. First, the dates. My original offer letter clearly listed May 3, 1994, but the HR system showed June 1st. I found a training schedule from May 1994 listing me as the new operations tech. A facilities roster from that same month had my name handwritten into the margin. Someone had corrected it on paper, but not digitally, and in 2010, when Ridgepoint switched over to a cloud-based HR platform, old records were imported. A clerical mismatch, harmless at the time, had now been weaponized. Then I found something more troubling, a series of monthly policy update memos dating back a year. Each was framed innocuously, under headings like operational streamlining or strategic resource allocation. But buried in the body of several documents were lines about aligning benefit liabilities with long-term fiscal forecasts and reassessing workforce tenure valuations in partnership with human resources and legal. I started highlighting terms: workforce optimization, liability reduction strategies, retirement eligibility window. Corporate speak, yes, but the language was too aligned, too coordinated. Someone had been planting seeds in advance, but what finally pulled it all together was an internal slide deck I'd printed 6 months ago, one I almost threw out. It was from a departmental town hall presentation, and on the third slide was a table titled Long-Term Benefit Projections. There were color-coded rows labeled high-exposure employees. The term meant nothing to most people, but I remembered it being used by Connor in a meeting once offhandedly as he discussed restructuring options. I'd asked him then what it meant, and he'd laughed. Just corporate lingo for folks nearing expensive milestones. There were 20 names on that table. Mine was one of them. The oldest employees. The ones with the longest tenure, the highest healthcare usage, and the most invested pensions. All marked as reviewed for role redundancy. I stared at that slide for a long time. This wasn't an accident. This was a process, a strategy, a quiet purge under the guise of modernization. The numbers hadn't just been wrong. They'd been deliberately manipulated, distorted in ways subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but exact enough to hit specific targets. And the worst part? They counted on me not noticing. They counted on me, being too old, too tired, too used to swallowing disappointment. They thought I'd take my severance and walk away. But I wasn't going to walk away. Not now. Not after seeing the whole picture. Not when I realized I wasn't just a name on a spreadsheet. I was a test case, a calculation. They'd taken 30 years of loyalty and run it through an algorithm. And now I was going to return the favor. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by documents that no longer felt like harmless company paperwork, but evidence, patterns, a quiet strategy buried beneath layers of jargon and spreadsheets. The more I stared at those highlighted lines and mismatched dates, the more one thing became clear. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't sloppy HR work. It was deliberate. But I couldn't prove intent on my own, not in a way that would hold up. That's when I remembered Linda Caraway. She had been Ridgepoint's Director of Human Resources for nearly 15 years before retiring the previous summer. Old school, no nonsense, sharp as a tack. She was one of the few executives who still walked the floor and called employees by name. She'd once fought with upper management to preserve maternity leave benefits when the board wanted to scale them back. She knew the policy book better than anyone, and more importantly, she had integrity. I still had her number saved. I stared at it on my screen for a few minutes, wondering what I'd even say. Then I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. "Malcolm?" she said immediately. "I heard about what happened. You okay?" Her voice hadn't changed. Calm, clear, like she could smell a lie before it left your mouth. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Off the record, about retirement policies, about timing, and about Connor Briggs." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Go on." I walked her through the details, the mismatched start date, the sudden termination 5 days before vesting, the memo from Connor, the benefit adjustment language in recent documents. I read her a few passages. She didn't interrupt, just listened. Then she let out a slow breath. "Malcolm," she said, her tone suddenly colder, more focused. "That's not incompetence. That's a strategy." She explained that during her final year, there had been subtle pressure from legal and finance to reevaluate legacy employees. Talk about retirement forecasting had started coming up more frequently. She hadn't liked the direction. It was one of the reasons she chose to leave when she did. "You weren't laid off," she said. "You were timed out." That phrase stuck with me. Timed out. This wasn't about savings. It was a scheme. And I wasn't the first. Linda didn't waste time. Within an hour of our call, she connected me with a labor attorney she trusted, Eli Navarro, a quiet, methodical man who'd spent 20 years handling wrongful termination and pension fraud cases. I sent over everything. My offer letter, pay stubs, the benefit memos, Connor's email, the internal slide deck. He called me back the next day with a tone I hadn't expected. Controlled urgency. "You have a case," he said. "And if even half of this is what it looks like, Ridgepoint's in serious trouble." Eli explained that what they had done, manipulating employment records to avoid benefit obligations, could be classified under federal labor violations. More importantly, if we could prove intent, it crossed into criminal territory. Pension fraud, willful misrepresentation, even potential wire fraud depending on how digital systems were used. But this couldn't just be a legal complaint. It needed weight, documentation, witnesses, a narrative. That's when Linda offered to step in. She agreed to write a sworn statement about the internal conversations during her final year, phrases like legacy cost containment and early benefit, intervention that had been floated in C-level meetings. She even had emails she'd saved. Professional paranoia, she called it. One in particular caught Eli's attention. An internal message from a senior finance officer to HR, recommending a review of employees within 6-month proximity to vesting thresholds. The next step was the Department of Labor. Eli helped me draft a formal complaint, attaching the timeline, documents, Linda's statement, and my full employment file. We sent it through the proper channels, and within 10 days, I received a call from a federal investigator named Jordan Watts. He was polite but direct, the kind of man who's heard every excuse twice. He asked me to walk him through everything again, dates, documents, how the discrepancy was discovered. I told him everything, including the moment I realized I wasn't just a casualty of budget cuts, but a target of a premeditated system. By the end of the call, he said, "We're opening a preliminary investigation. Don't contact anyone at Ridgepoint. Keep everything you've already sent backed up and secure." 2 weeks later, I received another call, this time from someone in the Department of Labor's Legal Enforcement Division. They wanted to schedule an in-person meeting. I drove to the federal building downtown, a folder of originals in my passenger seat and a knot in my stomach. The conference room was small. 2 investigators sat across from me with printouts of my documents already laid out. They asked precise questions about timelines, metadata on email headers, inconsistencies in payroll system transfers. I answered everything. Then one of them said, "Mr. Ritter, this isn't an isolated incident. We've had 3 other complaints filed in the past 18 months against Ridgepoint. 2 involved abrupt terminations within days of retirement. Eligibility. One of them had nearly the same wording in their exit paperwork as yours." That confirmed it. I wasn't alone. They showed me a spreadsheet recovered from Ridgepoint's internal audit software. It listed 20 employees over age 60 with more than 25 years of service. Each had a column labeled projected, vest date, and next to several names, including mine, was a second column labeled exit timeline. "This is the pattern we needed," Jordan said. "This wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate." I felt something shift then. Not relief, because none of this could undo what they'd tried to take, but clarity, purpose. They had built a system designed to quietly dispose of people who had given them everything. But now the system was under scrutiny, and I wasn't just a case file anymore. Was the beginning of something bigger. A week after that meeting at the Department of Labor, I got a call from Investigator Watts. His voice was calm, But this time there was something different in his tone. Momentum. "Malcolm," he said, "we've been granted a subpoena for Ridgepoint's internal communications and HR records. What we're finding is substantial." I didn't ask what that meant. I just listened. Watts explained that the department had recovered archived emails between Ridgepoint executives, specifically involving Connor Briggs and the company's legal counsel. In one thread, dated 6 months before my termination, Connor had written, "We need to evaluate high-cost tenure cases. Anyone within 6 months of vesting needs to be reviewed. Quietly." Another executive responded, "Understood. Run it through the HRIS migration discrepancy to maintain plausible deniability." Plausible deniability. They weren't even hiding what they were doing, just disguising it in layers of sterile language and systems jargon. They'd even joked in one message about cleaning up the pension cliff, as if people's lives and retirements were just items to be trimmed from a balance sheet. Within days of the investigation becoming official, more former Ridgepoint employees began coming forward. A man named Gerard, who had been terminated 4 days before his 25-year mark. A woman named Lisa, let go 1 week before she qualified for her full health care benefits as a cancer survivor. One by one, they contacted the Labor Department, or, in some cases, Linda Caraway, who was quietly working behind the scenes to connect people. Many of them had noticed something odd but never thought to question it. They didn't have the records, they didn't have the proof, but they had the same story. A cold meeting, vague justification, and benefits just out of reach. The Labor Department compiled the data, timelines, payroll inconsistencies, overlapping patterns. They found that over a span of 3 years, at least 14 long-term employees had been dismissed within 30 to 60 days of benefit eligibility. Most of them had been replaced with younger, cheaper hires, or had their responsibilities restructured into generic roles that required no benefit obligations. But it wasn't just the terminations that mattered. It was the conversations about them, the emails. In one particularly damning thread, Connor had sent a slide presentation to the executive team. One slide was titled, "Q3 Legacy Transition Strategy." Beneath it were names. Mine was there. So were Gerard and Lisa. Next to each name was a dollar amount, representing how much Ridgepoint would save by terminating each of us before our respective benefits vested. It wasn't just calculated, it was monetized. They'd put a price on each of us. Not based on performance, value, or service, but based on how much they could avoid paying out. I was numb, reading all this in the follow-up meeting where Watts laid it out. "You were right to come forward," he told me. "And thanks to your documentation, this is moving forward faster than most of these cases ever do." But I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if I hadn't kept that old offer letter. If I'd tossed those handbooks. If I'd believed Connor when he told me it was just business. How many others had been wiped from the books, without a trace? Ridgepoint had built its success on the backs of people like us. We fixed the problems, trained the teams, showed up when no one else would, and they'd treated us like expenses to be cut before year-end. This wasn't mismanagement, it was abuse, carefully planned, systematically executed, and now, finally, fully exposed. By the time the news broke, I was already expecting it. Still, seeing Connor Briggs's photo flash across the local news, head down, flanked by 2 federal agents, was something I wasn't prepared for emotionally. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It wasn't even victory. It was something quieter, like, the breath you hold for years finally exhaled. The Department of Labor's formal report hit the press a week later. The language was clinical, but the message was unmistakable. Ridgepoint Logistics had engaged in a deliberate scheme to terminate long-tenured employees to avoid paying out retirement and healthcare benefits. The evidence, emails, payroll timelines, HR records painted a damning picture. Connor was arrested on multiple counts, including wire fraud, benefit misrepresentation, and conspiracy to defraud employees. The company's general counsel resigned the same day. The HR director was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and the board? They scrambled to get ahead of the story, releasing a statement about rogue decision-making and a breakdown in ethical oversight. But no one was buying it. In a quiet meeting at the Department of Labor's downtown office, I sat across from a federal mediator who presented me with Ridgepoint's official response. The company was offering me a full reinstatement of my pension, retroactive to my original vesting date, full healthcare coverage, and a check, compensation for damages, pain, suffering, lost time, $125,000. Looked at the papers. Then I looked at Eli Navarro, my attorney, who gave a subtle nod. It was a fair offer, legally sound, financially significant. But something in me hesitated. It wasn't about the money. Not anymore. Because by then I wasn't the only one who'd come forward. 18 former employees had joined the investigation, each with their own version of my story, some less documented, some far more tragic. One man had lost his house, trying to cover his wife's medical bills after his benefits were cut off. Another woman had to delay surgery when her insurance vanished overnight, and none of them had been offered what I had, so I didn't accept it. Not right away. I want a condition added, I told the mediator. They restore benefits to everyone affected, not just me. There was a long pause. The mediator didn't argue. He simply said, I'll take that back to their counsel. 3 days later, Ridgepoint's board, now under public scrutiny and facing a federal audit, agreed. Every affected employee, every name on that spreadsheet would have their benefits reinstated, back pay calculated, records corrected. Some would receive settlements. Others would get the health care they thought they'd lost forever. As for Connor Briggs, he pleaded guilty to 3 charges as part of a deal. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release. The judge called his actions a betrayal of trust on a structural level. During sentencing, Connor didn't look up once. I wasn't there to watch. I didn't need to be. What I'd needed was to know that the system still worked. Flawed, as it may be, when you push hard enough, when you refuse to be silent. Ridgepoint's reputation never recovered. Within 6 months, the company was quietly acquired by a competitor. Most of the executive leadership was replaced. Their logo came down from the warehouse I helped build. I drive by it sometimes, just to see. They changed the name. But the foundation? That's still mine. What happened to me wasn't just personal, it was structural. A company didn't just fire a man 5 days before retirement. They built a system to do it quietly, to make it look normal, procedural, unremarkable. And the truth is, this happens more than people think. Not just in logistics, not just at Ridgepoint, but in every industry where profit starts to outweigh people. This story isn't just about loss, it's about accountability, and how that begins with something simple. Keeping records, trusting your instincts, and refusing to accept just business when it feels like something more. You'd be surprised how often the difference between justice and silence comes down to one person who refuses to walk away quietly. If you've ever seen something at work that didn't sit right, whether it happened to you or someone else, your experience matters. Sometimes sharing it is the first step toward change. Feel free to drop it in the comments. You never know who it might help. And if stories like this resonate with you, stick around, subscribe. We'll keep telling the ones that don't always make headlines, but should. Because the more we talk about it, the harder it is to ignore.